Hi, friends. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books I've been reading and authors I've been interviewing. And today, we are joined by the author Michael Jecks, who is coming to us from England. Yep, he's talking about his new book, Landscape of Murder. But this is about more than this new contemporary mystery book. This is about Michael and his life and all his books. He's written over 50 books. This man is a machine. The man can just write and write and write on all different things from Tudor times to modern times. He's doing another series going to be set back in the 1920s. He is a fascinating guy with a wonderful sense of humor. He's going to tell us all about himself, going to tell us about this book, this Landscape of Murder, in which his narrator and protagonist, whose name is Nick Morris, is a landscape artist. Yeah, whose main thing he draws, though? Cats. Yep, he draws cats. It's an interesting book. It's an interesting concept. He's a wonderful guy. So let's go right into that interview with Michael Jecks. Michael, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks very much, and hello to you.
So glad you could join us. And coming from England, we've never had a problem. We have people coming. We do better from people in Europe and coming talking to us than we do from people in America sometimes. So, but I was so happy to be able to connect with you. You've had a fascinating life, a fascinating career. We're going to get into that. But let's chat about you, because I think you're almost more exciting than your books. You're just so I'm amazed. I'm amazed at your life. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? Did you go to university? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in what was a tiny village called Chipstead in Surrey, and that's in the southeast, south of London, but way in the countryside. Back in those days, now it's part of London's conurbation, but it was wonderful because I was in the house. We had fields all around us, and it was a big house. It was quite an interesting time because I had three brothers and I was the youngest, and so I was the poor devil that was constantly bullied, obviously. But no, I was very lucky with three delightful guys. And I went to a school in Caterham in Surrey, which was about 10 or 11 miles away. I used to cycle there every day. And after that, I went to university briefly. I decided when I was quite young that I wanted to be an actuary because I'd heard that it was the highest paid profession. And it seemed like a good idea to me at the time, and I was quite good at maths. So I went to university and discovered that I was not that good at maths. And so I had 2 years of failing every exam I took, which was miserable. And at the end of 2 years, the professor in charge of the course and I had a little discussion, and we sort of came to the agreement that the university could probably survive without me any longer, and I could probably rub along without the university. So, after 2 years of a 3-year course, I dropped out and went straight into selling office equipment. I started out with typewriters because this is the very early 80s, and there weren't any personal computers then, until one firm I was working for were selling Olivetti typewriters, and they suddenly brought out a little portable word processor. I say it's portable. It weighed about 15,000 pounds, I think. It was huge. With a damn silly little screen you could hardly read, and in a box that was about 2 feet by a foot by 2.5 feet. It was huge. But it got me interested in the idea of word processors, and I moved from there to selling the ACT Sirius. There was a wonderful little Z80-based computer, and then I moved into a firm called Wordplex and started selling office automation and word processors full-time. I spent 5 years there, then I spent 5 years at Wang Laboratories selling their systems, and at about 1990, I'd spent 10 years selling these machines. And in the following 3 years, I managed to build up my career so that in 13 years as a salesman, I'd had 13 jobs. As a 2 of them lasted for 10 years. So I was motoring towards the end, but it was really that job number 13 seemed to me to be giving me a hint. And I decided, well, I can't stay in the computer industry because every job I was going for, I mean, I should just say every firm I worked for went bust. So I was owed a lot of money by a lot of these firms going bankrupt. And it seemed to me like it was a bit of a hint to get out of selling computers. So I thought, what else can I do? And I knew I loved reading. So I thought, I'll give myself 6 months and see if I can write a book. And I wrote 3 books in 3 months. And I've been doing it ever since, really.
Wow. Well, now, did you take any creative writing courses to help you along?
No, I thought it was far better to just jump straight in. And I mean, I didn't have the luxury of money behind me to be able to go on a course and things. We had the biggest mortgage we'd ever had, my wife and I. We had quite a lot of debts. It was at the time of Black Monday in the UK when the stock market crashed, and so the interest rate went up from 4% to 17%, I think, overnight. And we had enough concerns without thinking I could afford to take some time off and do a course.
Wow.
And
Well,
besides, I didn't have a very good experience with courses, as I say.
there you go. There you go. Now, you know, for people, we're here talking about a mystery, but you're more well known for your historical fictions, historical mysteries. Were you always a history buff when you grew up, or did that something come to you later?
Yes, I've always been mad keen on history, and especially warfare. If I could show that bookshelf over there, it is... Actually, I might be able to do that. I'll apologise for any strange noises. But you can see up here history of the First and Second World War, and there's the Oxford English History of the World, and all sorts. And I've basically got here 7 bookshelves, which are all my history research material. And all of the ones on this side, pretty much, I bought when I was in my teens and 20s. So I can remember once going to school on the train, and I was about 12 years old, and I was reading a book which is, they called it Passchendaele by Lynn MacDonald. It's still there. Great book, actually. She was a wonderful historian. But I always really was fascinated with the idea of warfare, how warfare affected societies, and in particular chivalry and the orders of knights. And that's what really got me into my first books, because the very first book I wrote was a modern day thriller. I always loved Frederick Forsyth and John Grisham and other modern day writers. But I just had this idea for... It basically came out because in 1993, my wife and I got married, and we spent some time down at a place in between Tiverton and Crediton in Devon on our honeymoon, and there was a manor near there called Fursden Manor, and it fascinated me because when we visited, on one wall somebody had written the family tree up, and the first of the Fursdens appeared there in 1284 or so. And I'd just finished reading a book called Dungeon, Fire and Sword by John J. Robinson, who's an American historian, and Dungeon, Fire and Sword was all about the Knights Templar. And it occurred to me, the first of the Templars were arrested and the order was broken up in the early 1300s. Well, if this guy Fursden had appeared about 15, 20 years later, he could have been a Knight Templar, because they weren't all killed. There were quite a few of them who escaped the torture and the executions. And it just made me start thinking about this location and what a guy would have been like if he had been a Knight Templar and he'd seen his order destroyed. He'd have seen that the Pope was supposed to be his only legitimate ruler, and yet he was the Pope who had helped the French king destroy the order. And I thought, yeah, he's going to be really conflicted because he's going to be deeply religious because all the Templars were, and yet he wouldn't have any trust in the church because of the Pope. He'd be still held by the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and yet he wouldn't have anybody that he could apply those oaths to. So it's got me thinking about what sort of character would this be. And I've always been a great fan of people like Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson. Crime books where you don't have an absolute genius in charge like Hercule Poirot. I mean, I would always say that Watson was clearly an intelligent bloke in his own right. And so I always thought it would be quite fun to have a crime series where you had two characters running it. And as soon as I'd been to Thurston Manor, I thought, well, that's got to be the first guy. It's a renegade knight who turns up in the middle of Devon, who's trying to forget his past, but it won't leave him alone. I thought he'd be a brilliant investigator because he'd have travelled the world, he would have seen battles, he'd know what happened with dead bodies, he would be really quite widely educated. I thought he'd be superb. And then I thought he'd also be the most useless investigator in Devon because he'd have no idea about the people, about the customs, about the local laws. He'd be hopeless. So I had to invent a second character, my Dr. Watson. And it came about because I was doing some research and found this guy whose name was Stephen Puttock. And Puttock is a very old English name. It actually comes from watching a hawk. When a hawk is, they call it stooping, when it's sitting riding the air, waiting and watching for a target, and then it puttocks down to go and catch the target. So it's a very old name. And I thought, that's fun. I could use that. And this guy was a sort of nouveau riche Englishman. And he started out in the early 1300s as a serf, so a servant, more or less a slave, owned by the Bishop of Ely. So he had nothing. He was very much a slave. He was property of the bishop. And yet by the time he died, he owned a chain of cottages he was renting out. He owned 2 sheepfolds. He had several flocks of sheep. And he was really doing very nicely. And the bishop thought that was good because the bishop took 10% of everything. So he was. So I thought he's the ideal sort of chap I want, someone who's a bailiff. So he's instructed in the law. He knows all the local people. He knows all the local customs. And then I could give him a few other little tweaks so I could make him a bit of a superstitious sort of person. And the two characters just bounced off each other beautifully. And I should just say, because I started off saying that I wrote the 3 books. The first book I was trying to write was a Frederick Forsyth book. That was really good, actually. It was called The Sniper, and it was all about a modern-day terrorist group coming to the UK and trying to pick off leaders of British society. And it was accepted by Bantam Press over the phone. They liked it so much. And it still hasn't got published because the rejection letter came through a week later because they'd seen it and accepted it in the week that the IRA agreed their first ceasefire. And it was all about the ruddy IRA.
We can't have that. No. Oh, my. Well.
So my first book that was actually published became The Last Templar, which is all about Baldwin and Simon.
Yep. Now, how many books are there in that series, Michael?
32 currently. 33 is on the blocks, ready to be finished and edited, but it's difficult. I mean, there's no publisher that's expressed much interest in it, so it'll hang around. I might just finish it off and put it out as an ebook. I've actually done that with that book just recently, which is One Last Dance Before I Die. Just destroying my office here. Yeah. So this one's a different type of book because it's crime, but it's set in 1922 in Shanghai, because I just found that period fascinating. And Shanghai itself was an amazing town. It is the only place in the world where it was more dangerous than Chicago in the 20s. You actually had some of Al Capone's cops. Not strictly true that they were his cops, although very likely some of them were, who went out to Shanghai. They had an exchange trip with Shanghai police going to Chicago and Chicago police going to Shanghai. But the Chicago police didn't last very long. They said it was far too dangerous and they insisted on going back. I think the Shanghai police looked on it as a bit of a holiday.
Well, I'll tell you, you've written many books. You have some other series, but now you decided again, and you change horses. Now you start this new contemporary crime mystery. I think it's called the Art of Murder series. What made you want to switch in and swing into that?
Well, it's the difficult thing for an author is that no one wants to be typecast. I think even Conan Doyle was not happy with the fact that he was typecast as being just Sherlock Holmes, because he actually didn't think that the Sherlock Holmes books were as good as his other books. Well, I disagree with him there, having read some of his other books, but still. For me, it was I had to change horses slightly. I went with the last Templar series and took them to Simon and Schuster, and I had several years there with Simon and Schuster. But after 4 books or so, they decided they wanted something a bit different. So I started writing the Vintner trilogy, which was all about the 100 Years' War, which ran from about 1349 for 100 years, roughly. And that was really very difficult to write. And the books are, I'm very proud of them, because what I wanted to do was cover the 3 main battles, which were the Battle of Crécy, 1349. Then the following year, there was the Siege of Calais. And 10 years after that was the Battle of Poitiers. And all of them were fairly classic battles, which I've been researching all of my life, really. And I've always found them fascinating. And I wanted to do it from the perspective of ordinary soldiers. You get these, there's an awful lot of war books, and they always look at things from the perspective of the king or the senior lords, and all of my books, I tend to focus on what the average bloke was, because I know jolly well. I mean, if you talk about people who believe they're reincarnated, they always have to be Napoleon, or they have to be King Louis, or I know damn well that if I was reincarnated, my origins would have come through from one of the sewage collectors or one of the road sweepers. I don't think that I would have come from very high stock. So I've always written my books from the perspective of the ordinary people. And one of the things I did actually start out with the Vintner trilogy, looking at it from the point of view of a knight, who was John de Sully. And the reason why I wanted to incorporate him was he was a knight who was involved in the 100 Years' War. But he was a very different sort of character, because he died at the age of 107, and he was one of 10 different centenarian knights at that time in about 1400. And he fought in his last battle, which was the Battle of Najera, when he was in his mid-70s, working for the Black Prince. So this was a fascinating bloke, and I wanted to use him. But very quickly, I reverted to type. And in fact, the books are really about a vingtaine, which is more or less what we call a platoon now, of archers. And it's the story of those archers, what their backgrounds were, why they joined the army, what led them to get involved in the different campaigns. But also it's a case of looking at them through the different battles. So the whole of my first book is really taken up with the campaign that led up to the Battle of Crécy. The second book is the year after that with Calais. And then I've got the 10-year break. And I wanted to show what was happening to ordinary people at that time. And the 10-year break happened because of the Black Death, the plague. And so part of the incentive for me was showing how different these guys were at the beginning of the war compared to 10 years later when they were fighting in Poitiers, and what happened to them, what happened to their families, what happened to the rest of the people around them. And the other aspect I wanted to include was not just looking at it from the point of view of these archers. I also wanted to look at things from the point of view of the French victims, because they were looking at how so many people were terrorized out of their villages and towns because the British army that went through there was brutal. I mean, they were absolutely appalling. And that's why, very long way around to get to there. But the reason why I started writing more different style of book was that it was really quite harrowing getting into and explaining and trying to put across the attitudes and the morals of these soldiers. That was really hard work. So I decided, I normally write 2 books a year, and I thought I've got to have something totally different. So I started writing the Blackjack series, which I've just editing now, book 9 in that series, which is set in Tudor England, and it's all involved around an utterly incompetent assassin who's employed through various nefarious people by Elizabeth, who would become Elizabeth I, but it's in the reign of Mary, her half-sister, before that. And it's the sort of trials and tribulations that this poor devil can get into because he's terrified of killing people, doesn't like the sight of blood, he's petrified of being injured himself. So he doesn't want to be an assassin, but someone made a mistake and assumed he was. And yeah, he was offered a lot of money and a house for free, and the girls seemed to like him, so he wasn't going to turn it down immediately. But he's got stuck, so now he's had to find a subcontractor to commit all these murders for him. So that was a fun thing. And now I'm getting to it. And the Art of Murder series came about because I just enjoyed writing that series so much. I thought something that's a bit different, that doesn't take quite so much research, would be good and enjoyable. So that's how I got into the Art of Murder series. It was thinking about writing something that's a bit more humorous, modern day, so I don't have to research anything at all, really. I can do that just sitting here typing. But it was just a case of, because of the Vintner trilogy, it was a case of finding something that was a bit easier on my brain, that wasn't quite so traumatic to write.
Okay. Well,
That was a very
it's
long
an
introduction. Sorry about
that's
that.
okay. It's it's an interesting. I really enjoyed it. I read both of the books. I liked it a lot, and so I enjoyed this. But hey, wait, before we go, you're not done with writing, because friends, there's another group of writing collaborators, which I think Michael put together, called the Medieval Murderers. Who are the medieval murderers? And tell me just a little bit about what you guys have been doing.
Well, this was one of those funny little things that happens. But back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was going to a lot of different festivals and crime writing gigs. And every time you go on one of these things, it's like the Bouchercon in the States, you'd get a panel of people. And uh, don't want to denigrate anyone, but there's some people that you got on with on these panels, some people you didn't. And I met up with a guy called Ian Mawson, who on a panel was just superb. He wrote books set in the 1200s in Oxford, and he's a bit of a thespian. He does a lot of directing of local theatre plays and so on, and he was very hilarious, really amusing, entertaining in front of an audience, and we got on really well. So I thought, it'd be fun to do another panel with him. And then a little while later, I met Susanna Gregory, and she was just wonderful, a lovely, kind, generous lady, superb writer, as anybody who's read any of her books would know. And she writes about the late 1300s, so a little bit after me. I'm pre-plague, she's post-plague. So that was all fun. And then I was, as a young callow writer, I was at the railway station once and I saw this book called The Sanctuary Seeker by a man called Bernard Knight. I thought, I'd never heard of him. So the book looked really good, so I bought it. It was set in the 1100s. I'll give it a try. So I read that, just ran through that really, really quickly because it was just so well written. And I thought afterwards, this is a guy who ought to be a member of the Crime Writers Association because he writes really well. He's got a really good idea for different things. So I contacted him. I said, yeah, I really think you ought to try joining the Crime Writers Association. And Bernard, bless him, wrote back and said, thank you very much, because he's Welsh. He said, thank you very much. But I was actually one of the founder members in 1950. I thought, oh dear, oops. But I met him a little while later, and I hadn't realised, but he was the Home Office pathologist who, when we had a horrible spate of murders around Gloucester committed by Fred West, Bernard was the pathologist who went round various areas of uh, Gloucester, Bristol, and Wales, digging up bodies that Fred West had left there. So he actually wrote the main handbook on forensic pathology called Knight's Forensic Pathology, oddly enough. He gave me a copy, and that back then that was worth 300 quid. It was a lovely book. But I do remember the first time I met him, it was at a crime writers event, and I wandered up and he wandered over and we shook hands. And immediately we'd shook hands, I thought, I wonder where that was this morning. But so Bernard Knight, I met him, we got on really well. And so Medieval Murderers was born because I suggested to them, rather than waiting till we're invited to go on panels at festivals, why don't we market ourselves as Medieval Murderers? We've got a great story to tell because Bernard was the 1100s, then we had Ian, who was 1200s, I was early 1300s, Susanna Gregory was late 1300s. Then we met Phil Gooden, who was 1500s, and then Karen Maitland as well, who was sort of all around the place. And Chris, C.J. Sampson too, he joined us. And we had this coherent story of different periods that we could all talk about. So we set up this performing group of authors with a view to at least 4 of us attending any event that we could get invited to. And the idea was that we'd basically just entertain. We'd be telling stories about our experiences as writers with publishers. We'd exchange war stories about copy editors we have hated and editors who have taken our money and all these different rather delightful stories, and put them together into evenings that always lasted far too long but were thoroughly enjoyable. And it was only after a couple of years of doing this that we had the idea that we ought to try to write a book. So we set about and wrote The Tainted Relic as a collaborative effort. But it wasn't all of us throwing everything into one book. This was, I hesitate to admit it, but it was a marketing campaign so that we could all use all of our characters in this book. So we had 15 to 20,000 words each. We were all writing a novella, effectively, of 15 to 20,000 words. But then we tied the whole thing together so that it was one coherent theme going through this book. So The Tainted Relic was based on the concept of, after the siege of Jerusalem, a piece of the true cross was discovered from one of the churches, and if anybody if anybody touched the actual splinter of the cross that was in a glass vial, then they died. So he had this sort of semi-superstitious concept going with it, and it was very successful. And in fact, Simon and Schuster bought that concept, and we had 10 books in the series. So
Good.
it was
That's
successful.
great. Very good. Now I got one more folks, we're going to get to this boat. Don't worry, we're going to get to it. But I got to ask you about the Tinners Morris. Who or what are the Tinners Morris? Because I think you started that also. Tell me about that.
Well, you see that painting there? That was a friend of mine painted us, Tinners Morris. Morris dancing is a very old, centuries old, cultural, expressive form of dance in England. The first Morris outfit, I think, was dated around the 1200s. They actually found it in the 1400s in the Tower of London. And it's been going on for centuries. It's some people think it's a pagan type of ritual. Nah, it's not. Um, but it almost completely died out after the First World War because just as the pals companions would all join up. So I used to be secretary of a pistol club in Caterham, and we lost 60% of the members on the first day of the Somme in that little club. And in the same way, Morris dancing sides joined up as groups, and they were wiped out. So it almost completely died out, and it's going through a real renaissance now. And there's a lot of folk musicians and folk dancers who are getting heavily involved in it. And it's just fun. But it's not just fun, it's also hugely energetic. So if you can imagine dancing, skipping, and hopping for an hour at a time, it's exhausting. But it is thoroughly good fun. And the great thing is, before I discovered I was diabetic, the amount of beer that gets given to Morris dancers is delightful. So if you're dancing on a really hot summer's day, you need to rehydrate somehow. And Tinners Morris was started around 2004. I was one of the founder members. And we are, well, I would rate Tinners Morris as being my closest group of friends. Delightful bunch of guys.
Good, good. All right, now we're going to get to your book. I know we got to get to it. We're going to get to it. But your main character is a guy by the name of Nick Morris. Now, I see the Tinners Morris. I hear Nick Morris, and Nick Morris is a painter. And behind us, friends, you can see paint right up there, right above him. You see Michael's artwork. He's an artist also. So, are you Nick Morris? Are you your own inspiration for the book? No.
No, he's far brighter than me. No, it's one of those things. I mean, I've always loved painting. That was my daughter and my wife peering over the edge of a bridge in France a few years ago. But I paint and sketch a lot because if you're out and about, one of the main things I always feel with my books is that the locations are part of the character set. And it's how I react to a location will define to an extent how the story goes. And one thing I always do, I discovered this years ago, is rather than going around with a mobile phone and snapping quick photos, that doesn't leave you with an impression of the place. But if you go round with, I don't know what there is in this one. Oh, here we go. Yeah, just with a sketchbook. And then if you sit down and try to paint a scene, it fixes the colours, it fixes the position of everything much more firmly in your head. And so many, many years ago, I started painting and sketching as part of my research for my books. But that wasn't why I picked Nick Morris. I mean, the idea behind that came about because I was thinking, what sort of character has no one actually used as a crime investigator before? And I thought, there's been so many people who have said, oh, yes, well, this guy's an author. He's obviously a perfect investigator for crimes. And so you got authors inventing authors. That just doesn't work for me. I think it's lazy apart from anything else. And so I was thinking, well, what sort of other profession could you have? And I wondered about a cook, a professional cook who goes and works in different people's houses. That's still appealing, and I might well come back to that as a concept. But I liked the idea. I actually had this idea first about 20 years ago, but I was on contracts then for 2 books a year already, and I really didn't have time to try to develop it. But I just had this idea that if you've got a portrait painter, then part of their job is looking at a face and seeing the character behind it. And I thought, what an interesting concept. If I had a portrait artist, I could give him much more insight into the other people's way of thinking than I could do with most other types of professional. So it really developed from that. I was just thinking about different types of career. And then, of course, I thought, well, a portrait artist, now that's going to be fun because he will be meeting the rich and famous, because it's only the rich and famous who get portraits painted nowadays. So I thought, oh, yes, I can use business people. I can use the landed gentry. I can use really shady, crooked people. I can, the opportunities are endless. The first one was very loosely based on actual events in a village that I know where somebody committed suicide, but he was such a sociopath that quite a few people who knew him found it very hard to believe he would commit suicide. So that sort of developed in my brain as being, well, perhaps somebody else that he owed lots of money to wasn't quite so forgiving as other people. So that was the idea behind Portrait of a Murder. Landscape of Murder came about because I was actually in this village, Tissington, last year, and I met the guy who owns the village, and it is one man. He's a knight who owns the whole area, and his family have owned it for centuries. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, and I sort of developed from there into a separate direction. But the next one, which I've got to start writing very soon as I've finished editing this next Blackjack book, is going to be based in Piacenza, because I've decided Nick's going to go out to Piacenza in Italy, and he's going to be running an art school or an art course for a couple of weeks during the Piacenza Festival, which is a really fabulous literary festival that they hold every year. And it's because Piacenza is on the Po, massive river in Italy, and it's a really significant river. They consider it to be their version of the Mississippi. And so every year they have this blues and literary festival, which is wonderful fun. And I thought, oh, I've got to include that because I had such fun when I went there. So I'll include that as the main location for this next book. That'll be fun.
Well, the thing about Nick, and this is I found hilarious, what is Nick's specialty? What does he do portraits of?
Well, the poor devil's lumbered with the difficulty of having to paint cats, because it's one of the few areas where people are prepared to pay a few £100.
and he hates cats. That's the thing.
Well, they always attack him. He's got scars up both arms.
I love it.
I was going to say, he still considers himself actually a landscape artist, but he can consider himself that all he wants. I'm still getting him doing portraits all the time.
Now you take him to Tissington, okay? And we gotta cut through a lot of this stuff here. It's a fun book, but he gets to Tissington, and where is Tissington? Now that's the first thing. I don't know where it's at. It's somewhere in England.
Yes, if you go directly north of London, you will north and slightly west, you'll come to Derby in Derbyshire, and Tissington is a few miles outside Derby, quite close to a place called Ashbourne, which is a wonderful Georgian town, well worth a visit.
Okay, if I ever get to England, you take me on a tour there. So, wow, yeah. Now we have a murder. Yeah, there is a murder. We finally get to we have a murder here in this book, and he was so happy that he didn't discover the murder. Why is that? Why was he so happy he didn't discover the murder?
Well, because it was only the previous year he was down here in Devon, and he discovered a murder. And you as a sensible chap, you don't want to get a reputation for finding dead bodies all over the place. It tends to lose your friends and influence. So he was very delighted that somebody else actually found the body. God, you can't treat my book seriously.
Now, friends, there is a murder in this book, yes, and we're going to get to that. But I mean, we're not going to tell you about it because you got to read the book. But what's fascinating is Michael is such a wonderful author that he has a murder, and then you don't know about the murder because there are other crimes that are being committed. Other crimes are being committed. And around 100 pages later, we get back to the murder. Did you do that on purpose to divert our attention? That was fascinating.
Yes, entirely
Okay.
intentional. I mean, it's a strange thing writing a crime book because you have to have. There are some flexible rules to do with crime stories. One is that you must have a certain number of suspects, and each of them has to have a good motive. Now, I start off writing a book not knowing where the book's going to go. I'd never start off with a plan, which is a bit difficult when a publisher asks for a synopsis before they'll give an advance, for example. But I always start out not knowing where the story's going to go, and so what I'll tend to do is I'll start with a dead body, I'll backfill and I'll forward fill, but I start off with a blank sheet and basically I start writing from that position. But you must have a certain number of suspects. Now, I tend to think 5 to 6 is the ideal number of suspects because fewer than 5 and it's really difficult to build momentum in the story. More than 6 and you can't actually concentrate enough on each of the different suspects. And all of my Templar series tended to be written from the point of view of each of the different protagonists. So I wouldn't just have the two investigators' inner thoughts, I'd also have the inner thoughts of the guilty party and the different suspects. And meshing all of that together was part of the fun and the joy of the writing. With the Nick Morris books, I prefer to write them first person. And so it's very much his own perspective and how he views what other people are doing and his insights into them based on his own understanding of human nature and so on. And the main thing is that I believe you still have to have at least 5 suspects, all of whom have really good motives. So if you're writing a book about a murder, then you obviously have the normal sort of things of sex and money and jealousy, or the other motivations. But if you're talking about something where there is other crime involved, then it sort of makes sense to me to broaden it out into a whole raft of different crimes and then incorporate all of them. And so Nick did discover quite a lot of undercurrents, I think it's fair to say, in a small town near Derby.
Yeah. He did. He did. I mean, we've got canisters. I'm not going to get into the canisters. We have canisters involved. We got illegal sales to Iran. I mean, this just goes on and on. It's a wonderful book. I mean, I tore through this book. I just love this book. I mean, they're all people are after Nick. I mean, we got it again. I can't say enough about this book. I really, really enjoyed it. And one thing I did like though is you never made Nick smarter than the police. He never like in the cozy mystery genre where, oh, we know more than the police do. Yeah, it wasn't Nick at all. He was reluctant to even do
But
this.
it's so unrealistic, isn't it? It's so
Yes, it
untrue. I
is.
mean,
It is.
if,
Yep.
if I saw a murder and I had some sort of motive and interest in trying to discover who was guilty, I would no way be able to compete with the police. I mean, the police have DNA, they have forensics, they have experience, little things like that that really help them. And me, I spend all my day sitting in a darkened room hoping that inspiration's going to strike. I am not a genius at investigating murders. So the thought that you can write a nice cozy novel and my word, this person who happens to be an artist or a cook or a writer could be a genius at sorting out. No, let's not be stupid. In the same way,
Exactly.
it's
Thank you.
well, it's like the standard cliche is that a police officer must be divorced, must be an alcoholic or a recovering alcoholic, have a chip on his shoulder because he's not as important as he's. Yeah, it's just not true. I know so many police. I mean, I've got one who lives, a retired police officer lives there, another one lives up there, another one lives up there, and there's another one lives over there. And I've been involved with the police in a good way for a number of years. And they all tend to be quite well settled, sensible, reasonable people. And apart from the fact they're infinitely more knowledgeable about crimes than I am, um, just the idea that someone could walk in and start investigating murders and do it more efficiently than them is just laughable. And
I just saw something about a book which has got a title something like "The Dandelion Cafe on Cherry Island." Are you kidding me? People don't name things like that. It's just so unbelievable, and yet they're people buy these by the gazillions. It's unbelievable. I can't believe. Oh my. Oh my. Well, now let me ask this: how many books do you envision in this series of Nick Morris? Because this is a fascinating guy.
oh, I was once at an event with my friend Phil Gooden, and we were on a panel, and we were asked by a member of the audience, "How many books do you think would be the ideal number?" And Phil is a delightful bloke, and he's quite serious. He used to be an English teacher in a big school, and he looked very seriously at this questioner and said, "Well, you can't really have more than about 11 because after 10 or 11, the author just runs out of ideas." And I nudged him in the ribs and said, "I've just written book 21." And he said, "Apart from Mike, who can do?" And that's the point. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't ever look at how long a series is likely to be. The Vintner trilogy, yes, that was always going to be 3 books because there were the 3 battles. But something like the Nick Morris series could be any number. I say the last Templar series is 32 currently. But what people tend to forget is that even if you're writing medieval stories, you can incorporate any aspects of modern life you like because human frailty and human motivation hasn't changed. And so I was able to incorporate, for example, child murderers. I was incorporating rape, incest, and God knows what else in my medieval books because they were taken from the news gathering that I was reading present day. Then again, I also had the extreme delight of things like the records of the Grand Heir of 1238, I think it was, which listed all of the murders that had been committed in the previous 10 years. Because in medieval times, you had a turn. So the judges would literally travel around the whole country and they would listen to all of the cases that had happened in that county. And it took them 10 years to get round the country and then return to the same place. So if you committed a murder just after the judges had left, then you were safe for at least a good 10 years. It's quite handy. But all of these things were meticulously recorded. The court judgments were recorded meticulously. And they are occasionally published as books. And I've bought several of those books. So I've had lots of different pieces of research given to me on a plate to a large extent. But with Nick Morris, certainly not less than 10, I'd imagine. But I would easily be able to see it increasing dramatically beyond that. Mainly because I like it. And this is one aspect that a lot of people don't twig, I don't think. They don't realize. Um, I was once told when my first book came out by a Canadian friend of mine that what I needed to do was write about Formula One racing or baseball, because both of those had such huge fan bases. I'd sell thousands of copies of books and I'd make myself extremely rich. And he might well have been right, apart from one detail, which is I've no interest in either Formula One racing or in baseball. I've got no interest in them whatsoever. And so I I firmly believe if you're going to write about something and you're going to try to enthuse the reader, you can only do that if you're enthusiastic about the subject. If you're not interested in the subject, you're going to be bored writing it and you're going to bore the pants off anyone picking up the book. So I only ever write about things that I'm interested in. And I have a lot of interests. So, so I think while I'm still interested in Nick Morris and while I'm still interested in the situations I can throw him in, the series will carry on.
Okay, good. Now, question for you. I've got my wife's relatives. They're from Romania. They now live in England, speak English, read English. Where can they pick up all your books? Where can we find them over in England? Because I want to make sure they start getting hooked on all your works.
Yeah. Oh, I think they should. Uh, any bookshop or library or Amazon. I mean, my books are available all over the place. It's embarrassing, really.
So they're not out of print. Most all your books are still in print?
Uh, I think it's fair to say most of them are ebooks now, but that's just the way the publishing industry is going. So all the yeah, very often you get them print on demand. So
Right. Okay. So I can tell them. I can tell Sebastian, I can Ramus. I say, go to Amazon or go to what's it? Is it Watersons? Waterstones? Is that the big bookstore over there?
Waterstones, yeah, they'll have quite a few of them,
They'll
but
have
it,
them.
it
Okay.
depends on the store because Waterstones tend to they used to focus on local authors for individual branches. Now everything's organised and purchased centrally, so you can't ever be too sure what's going to be in where. But the other thing is that if they go to a library, I sounds daft, but I get as much money out of people borrowing a book from the library as I do from a sale of a book. It's
Hmm. Well,
crazy.
as long as you're making money, that's all that matters. Hey, now
Oh yeah.
we you've mentioned it a little bit before. What's next? You got you mentioned so many projects. What's next? What are we going to see next from you? Another one, the other series, the new one, and this one. What's coming on? Give us the next year or two in your life. What are you planning?
Well, oh well. Ugh. The first thing I've got to do is finish a first in a new series called The Mrs. King, which is set in the 1920s, and it's two sisters whose fiancés died in the First World War. Which is based on two ladies called the Mrs. King, uh, that I knew when I was a kid back in the 60s, early 70s. And both of them had lost their fiancés and they'd lived together because they were two of the superfluous women. That's what they were actually called, which is just a horrible term. But I've always had a hankering to write a book about them and explain what life was like for those women after the First World War. So that's next on the cards. Then it's Piacenza with Nick Morris. And then I've got to write another Blackjack book, book 10 after that. Then I've also got to go back and edit The Sniper, which is this first book I wrote. And I think I'm going to edit that and put that out. But I've also got another book, Power and the Money, which I want to edit and get out as well. Plus, I've got to edit and finish off book 33 in the Templar series. So I think it's safe to say I haven't got much spare time.
When do you get to do everything else? I mean, you're just writing constantly. It seems like.
Well, that's the main thing about having two dogs. I have to take them out, so I have to get some exercise every day. And I try to do a sketch every day while I'm out. I was chatting to Ian Rankin not that long ago, and we both agreed that the first thing that led us to want to be writers was the fact that we loved reading books. And the trouble is, now that we're writers, we get very little time to read.
That's true. That's very true. Well, friends, I'll tell you what, I would just want to say a great big thank you to Michael Jecks for being on our show today. Mike, you've been a wonderful guest. I appreciate you coming on. I can't wait. Put some more out. I'll come back to you. We'll talk again and again, okay?
Thanks very much for your time. Thanks a lot.
Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. We laughed a lot. We learned a lot. I mean, this is one interesting guy. My nephew's over in England. You know what? Get this guy's books. You're going to really love it. Your kids are going to love it. It's a lot of fun. I was going to say here in the United States, you can get them almost all here at the library. You can get them on Amazon, anywhere. You can get them from my viewsonbooks.com website. Yeah, you want to get these books. They're a lot of fun. They're really interesting. What am I looking at? Well, I'm just looking to stay alive. Yeah. What do you mean? Well, in the last week, we have had our heating unit spring a leak. We've had our microwave no longer works. We have our oven no longer working, and the refrigerator shut down. Yeah, I'm telling you, just staying alive in this household is getting tough. So I'm looking at this. How about you? You talk about spring cleaning. I'm having spring appliance updates. I'm telling you, thank God we got the refrigerator going. Tomorrow, sometime, they're supposed to come for other things. God knows when they're coming for the stuff on the ceiling. I don't know. I'm just trying to look at being safe and sane for the next week until I get back to you. I'll let you know how that goes next week. So anyway, on behalf of my website, viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages